To this discussion, and it's great, particularly after lunch, that we have some entertainment and some great visuals that will be seen. And of course, the theme, and it's on your programs and brochures and stuff: healthier, innovative, capable, and inclusive communities, nutrition-sensitive landscape. So, a lot of talk on the last panel that I moderated in here on nutrition-sensitive agriculture, ending hunger, ending the hunger season, increasing the nutritional capacity of the food. But it's really important that we also talk about doing that in a sustainable way and what that does to the whole landscape of food production and the whole ecosystem of the earth and how we keep that in balance as we go about all these tasks. So we're great. We've got a really esteemed panel of folks from the leading universities in the country and big thinkers and leading thinkers on all of this. But we're going to start off with, before we get to the panel, and they'll then be responding to what we're going to be hearing from two keynote speakers. We have Johan Rockström from the Stockholm Resilience Center that's really enhancing our understanding of sustainability and sustainable development, and then from Dimick from National Geographic, which is really doing a fascinating series and a great look throughout the year on food production, feeding the planet, again, and as National Geographic does so well, doing all that with the proper stewardship and care of the earth, both of the earth itself and of the people that inhabit it. So we'll start off with Johan, and then after that, then Dennis will go. So this will give us a good start. Thanks, Johan.
So thanks, Roger, and good afternoon, everyone. Now I'll be giving a kind of broader keynote 4 o'clock, and then hopefully to then incite you to stay on to that. I decided not to show too much of what will come then, and rather focus here on sharing with you an initiative that is at the heart of this integrated agenda of sustainable and healthy food systems, namely the EAT initiative. And to come to the EAT initiative, though, I'd like to just enter this theme from my own perspective, which is with a background in agricultural sciences, but also leading an international research center on global change research and resilience, and also been very deeply involved in developing something called Future Earth, which is the largest integrated research initiative in the world on global sustainability science, where CCAPS, for example, is involved. And I believe that Future Earth is a manifestation of science reacting on its own findings. So 30 years of advancements in Earth system science has shown beyond any doubt that we're now in a completely new juncture with regards to human development. We're seeing on empirical observation that we're hitting the ceiling of the ecological capacity of planet Earth to support the modern world as we know it. And at this juncture, there's no other pathway to eradicate poverty or eradicate hunger or achieve economic development than a transition into a safe operating space of a stable and resilient Earth system. And this requires of us in the agricultural domain, because agriculture is the decisive sector that will determine whether or not we succeed, because it is the largest cause behind climate change, the largest single cause behind biodiversity loss, the largest single consumer of fresh water, the largest single user and interfere in the global nitrogen phosphorus cycle, the largest single, therefore, integrated force of change at the planetary scale. So there's no other pathway than a transformation into sustainable intensification, because we can no longer expand ourselves into a future where we need to increase food production by 50-60% to really reach diets for a world population of 10 billion by 2050, 2060. Now that is a challenge of enormous magnitude. It's a new green revolution. It's a completely new type of green revolution which requires much, much more innovation than the first green revolution, because suddenly it has to occur on sustainable grounds in a shaky ground, because it's shaking due to rising volatility in freshwater supplies because of climate change, and the fact that we are in a true ecological turbulent phase in the future. So it's truly a challenge beyond anything we've seen any time in the history of humanity. And then on top of all that, we increasingly recognize that the really dramatic curves of exponential pressure on the planet is one thing, but they look exactly the same when you look at the food-related health challenges that faces humanity, with obesity curves running high, with diabetes running at actually epidemic levels in some parts of Asia, and the fact that we're not getting away from stuntness and large parts of the malnutrition related to young, small kids affecting their entire life trajectories. And Walter Willett and Mandana will be talking, of course, much more on this. And I think we need to recognize that this integrated challenge of health, sustainability with food as the decisive factor which will determine both health and sustainability, or health of both planet and people, is at the center stage of development in the future. And surprisingly enough, as I think we know in this room, these professions have not been working very closely together, neither academically, nor professionally, nor in policy. In the agricultural science area, we've been focusing so hard on water use efficiencies, water productivities, yield improvements, livelihoods, but very much focusing on the production side. Of course, looking into the value chains all the way to consumers, but not so much connecting the indicators of success with health parameters. And on the other side, fantastic advancements in our understanding on health, increasingly putting into place what constitutes healthy diets and what exactly is a desired future in terms of balances in diets, even though there's a lot of debate still even in that area. But what if we would combine these two? What if we would launch an hypothesis that there's a synergy, that in fact healthy diets may in fact per automatique be more sustainable, and that we can actually have a true synergy if we invest in sustainable and healthy diets, both in terms of reducing waste and in terms of producing more healthy food systems. And where does this not apply? Where are the clear cases where we have unsustainability and unhealth concentrating in the same food systems, which then, of course, should somehow be regulated out of the production systems and at least become very expensive in the consumer end. And because, I would argue, we don't have that knowledge. We don't have the empirical knowledge base of what constitutes sustainable and healthy diets, which of course is very surprising. Many will argue, oh yes, we're doing that, but when you look at it, we do it partially for climate. There's health, diet analysis, looking at carbon footprints, for example. But so far, at least, I've not seen any attempt to truly incorporate biodiversity, ecosystems, fresh water, nutrients, chemicals, and carbon, and complement that with our knowledge on nutrition with regards to salt, sugar, fats, cardiovascular disease, etc. And the EAT initiative is an effort to fill that gap. It's an effort of joining forces between agricultural science, medical public health science, and sustainability science, and start addressing the metrics, the integrated synthesis, and the knowledge to support investments, scorecards, guidelines for business and for policy in terms of a transition towards sustainable and healthy diets and food systems, so from production to consumption. And the EAT initiative is interesting in the sense that it's a co-design between science, policy, and business. So it has a very strong link with business already from the very beginning, which is a sensitive area, as we all know. But it's interesting to have business around the table putting some of the difficult questions on the table and what they would like to see from science in terms of guiding business models that can take us towards more sustainable and healthy food products. The EAT initiative is very young. It's only 1 year old. It's held one forum. It held one EAT event last night at the UN headquarters, but is now at a stage of formulating a research agenda. So I would very much hope that this session could actually be an opportunity to explore what would be the research questions in this integrated complex, the nexus on food, health, sustainability, across healthy and sustainable diets that we could explore together. Walter Willett and Mandana, Arabi are on the advisory board of the EAT initiative. And I'm chairing that advisory board, and would love to bring anything that comes out of this session back into that platform for dialogue. And the CGIAR is a member of the EAT initiative, so Frank Reisman actually sits on the advisory board, which is fantastic, because with that we also get the wide spectrum of development-oriented agricultural research with us in this initiative. So that's where I'd like to stop now, more as a kind of an urge for the coming dialogue. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Johan, and great for framing the discussion. So, Dennis, National Geographic.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this. Actually, the nature of my talk and why I'm here is actually, I'm not talking to you folks specifically, but what I'm doing is trying to explain to you the urgency and trying to raise the profile of this discussion with the general public. And I will begin here because 40 years ago it was this kind of place. This is where I grew up, okay? I grew up on a farm in Oregon. This is what I saw when I was a kid. This is one of my early published pictures, and this is me baling hay 40 years ago. So I was on the land. I grew up on the farm. I earned my money to go to college. So this is not, by doing this, so this is not some late to the party interest of mine. It's been a lifelong interest, and so is photography. So with apologies to Grant Wood and the American Gothic aesthetic, this was my late attempt at my parents with said pitchforks with real corn in front of a real barn. So fast forward 40 years. And so what we have here is then you see perhaps a logical 4 decades later conclusion of a passionate interest in this kind of thing, where as a kid who studied agriculture in college, I often felt like we were out in the wilderness and there were other bigger issues, fish to fry. So now here in May of 2014, the issue is front and center on the cover of National Geographic, the first issue of 8 this year that we are discussing this compelling issue in a variety of ways. And I think that the issue is it's much about why food now. And so it's not just some isolated, let's start talking about food and why it's so urgent, but I think we have to go back and we realize that it's part of a whole integrated set of questions that we're trying to deal with as human society. It's the question of, we've been listening to discussions of 2 degrees and global warming and climate change all day long, and can we manage risk and keep the planet under 2 degrees? Well, we're already seeing manifestations of that in the loss of the ice. These are all cover stories that we have been doing in the magazine over the past decade. Or this question of like, then we'll just grow corn to create ethanol. Well, that creates its own problems when you're competing against the food chain. And then I think the question of climate and energy, they are 2 halves of the same whole, and we've been trying to convey that idea to our readers, that you cannot really discuss climate without also discussing the energy systems that we create and rely upon. But then if it's not just disruption of the carbon cycle, then it's also the hydrological cycle, the water cycle. And we did a special issue on that in 2010. And across 2011, we had a year-long series on world population when it was about ready to hit 7 billion. So they're all connected. And food really becomes the next logical question. And we've been discussing food for a long time. In September of 2008, we put soil on the cover of the magazine, where food begins. Who's going to put a story about soil and soil conservation on the front page of a 40 million circulation magazine? Well, it's useful because it helps you understand when you look at the kind of soil that people inherit, whether it's the woman in Mali or the woman in China, the soil that you inherit largely determines the success of the civilization that you create. Same thing you see right here in Kansas, the deep soil in Kansas versus the rocky soil in Syria. Those go a long way towards explaining some of the headlines we see in the news today. but it's also about genetics and genetic diversity. And as part of the series on food here, Carrie Fowler of the Global Crop Diversity Trust, we were trying to help people realize that preservation of diversity of genetics, of varieties of crops and livestock, are so essential because they become the toolkit that will allow us to continue to grow crops that are, to use the word, resilient against a changing global environment. And also it will provide the seed stock that we need to breed varieties that are resistant to things like UG99, wheat stem viruses. Those are the toolkits that are going to allow us to adapt to the changing world. So those questions, though, of the changing world, I think in 2008 there was the global food price spikes. We covered that in 2009, trying to get at that issue. But what are some of the big key underlying issues? Well, it has to do with this. More people. And in 1900, we were only 1.6 billion, and Carl Haber, the Population Reference Bureau, came up with this. And look, just a century later, we've gone to 6.1, and then another 12 years later, it's 7.1, and 9.6 by 2050. But then the study just out last week from the UN and Science projects at 11 plus by 2100, and population isn't going to flatten out until later. So all of these challenges that all of us are talking about today only become more dramatic and compelling. But then it becomes even more so because we're wanting to eat up the food chain. Higher on the food chain, more protein in our diets, and that has a geometric impact on resources, more land devoted to crops that are used to feed livestock, more water, more energy, where everybody wants to eat like Americans. And that has an impact on if you have infinite aspiration on a finite planet, at some point something has to give. And then to come back to this question of the stage that we're on, the Arctic ice, okay, right? Biggest geologic shift that we've seen in history, at least in known history. This is satellite pictures of the Arctic ice cap in '79. This is the same thing 30-odd years later. Half of it's gone. It's projected to change weather in the mid-latitudes. That has an impact on our ability to grow food. Or this study by David Battisti and Roz Naylor in Science in 2009. This is showing summers hotter than the hottest summers we've seen before, and we talk about ability of crops to withstand heat and drought. Well, then you dial it ahead to the end of the century using business as usual emissions projections. It's going to be a hot world, and it's hard for crops to compete with that kind of thing. That's why we're doing this now. To start a conversation, but also to reconnect eaters with farmers and eaters with the landscapes that they rely on. I was in a session earlier this morning in the next room, and a gentleman from Burundi said that the kids in his country, when asked where food comes from, they say, oh, from the store. And it's the same thing that happens in so many cultures now. And so what we're really trying to do is to help reconnect people back to what it is, this incredibly extensive and also very fragile enterprise that keeps us all alive. And so this was, I will quickly run through the stories. And so it became, the first one was actually derived from a paper that John Foley, who published this in Nature in October of 2011, and it was what was called a 5-step plan to feed the world. And it's like, what is interesting is I put this slide together, I was going, oh, these are the same ideas that we seem to be talking about here prevalently today. And so freeze footprint, grow more on farms, use resources more efficiently, shift diets, and reduce waste. One thing I don't think we've heard much about is how high on the food chain we can eat. How long can we afford to live high on the food chain? So that was the structure of it. But visually, then what we were trying to do was also show here the incredible scale of this enterprise. It is immense in its scale that people don't understand just how profound. So we want to urbanize the world. So what does it take to transform landscapes, to turn them into this essentially huge industrial enterprise? Yet at the same time, and I'm here to thank CGIAR today personally, because without the support of the research centers, the pictures that appeared in that story that Jim Richardson did would not exist today. And so these portraits of farmers in Bangladesh, in Mali, in Bali, in Peru. All of these pictures are a direct result of the support of the researchers in the CG centers who helped Jim go out into the land to meet people. Not necessarily the ones from Iowa, because he knew where they were, but they were. But I hope you get the general idea. And what we're trying to do is not to speak to this idea that it's not just a huge thing, but it's also very personal, and that we all rely on somebody who's out there who's working hard and growing the food that we all rely upon. So it's an attempt to really reconnect us to the people. And though we may look at this one and think there's the farmer, but in fact the faces of the farmer are vastly more diverse than this gentleman from Kansas, who himself is a wheat farmer. And then we go on to this idea of aquaculture, and we've been farming the land for 10,000 years. What happens is we farm the sea, and that's really what it was about, this idea of can we grow protein to help meet our dietary needs, and the conversion ratios to feed on fish are actually quite good compared to other kinds of animals. And then the question of Africa and transformation of agricultural landscapes, we looked at that in terms of this idea of land grabs, and what happens if you have essentially in some ways a medieval agricultural landscape, and what happens when industrialization comes in, and what benefits and what ills, and what benefits to the people on the ground, the people who live there, the smallholders. And that's a big question, and already there's quite a bit of export from Africa to the Middle East in terms of livestock. So what we're trying to do really, I think, with this whole thing is to just really try to help unpack the technical nature of it and make it accessible to people. And if you're going to do a series on feeding the planet, you better take a look at what's happening in our own country right here. And 47 million people are on food assistance in the United States. And the varieties of reasons for that are complex. And they deal with, wages. It deals with living in very expensive places and having to spend all your time working, or living in places where you must have a car in order to just get to the store. So and this is just showing the people who are the percentage of people on food assistance. Every county in the nation, somebody near who is probably on food assistance, and you don't know about it. And then this question of the diet, we've heard about the paleo diet, and so it's sort of like, what can we learn from the past to inform the diets that we consume now? So we go back and we look at indigenous diets around the world to see what it is, what we can learn from that and how we might benefit from that, is a way to find perhaps a healthy diet for all of us. This story just out is really on the biotechnology and the role of plants, and it's not just about genetics, it's not just about biotechnology, it's also about this question of good agricultural practices. And we're trying to get at that, but we're also trying to help people realize that this issue of biological tools in agriculture is not just GMOs. And we're trying to help speak to something where the debate is more nuanced than just say GMO yes, GMO no. But there's actually some very interesting work that's happening in the middles. And we're doing this because we're trying to develop crops that are more photosynthetically efficient, are more resilient to drought and heat, and all of the things that everybody's been talking about here. Next month, we talk about meat, and we use the American landscape as an example. Can everybody eat like we do? And what does that mean for the planet? We'll be exploring that, and we use Texas as an example, so you can just see these pictures have not really been seen, but what you're seeing here is a preview of coming attractions. And the last thing really is about culture in food. Remember, agriculture, it's not just agribusiness. There's also the culture of agriculture. And what we're trying to do, too, is not just speak to the issues, but we're trying to speak to the cultural part of food. And it's such a central part of the world that we live in. And so trying to realize that, we had lunch today, right? We're going to have a reception later. It's all about the gathering of the human community. So we're trying to find different ways in that aren't just about technical issues, but to try to help people realize that they don't even think about this, but this is such a central part of the world that we inhabit. And any meal would not be complete without condiments, and so we also have small things throughout the magazine, like on the variety of apples, or the origin of forks, or food miles, where food comes from, and a map showing where did all that stuff in the picture from that store in New York come from, helping people realize, or what does meals ready to eat mean, MREs? Well, this is what's inside. See, so it's just trying to find novel ways to get at this. So that's at natgeofood.com. And then on our website, you see, we're continuously updating it. It's not just the articles, but it's like we have news articles. I've written some columns for it. And so it's about this project is going to continue. The publication of this project in terms of every month is going to slow down after this year, but we're going to continue online. This is a proof post, our photography blog, where Jim Richardson talked about the story of going out into the field with the CG support staff. And we have food bloggers, and this is all online. So it's all there, and our goal really is to keep this going for the next 5 years. So just as all of you who are here, knowing that this challenge is only going to become more intense and preoccupying for all of us, we're trying to pay attention to this issue too for the long haul. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Dennis and Johan. Beautiful pictures, profound thoughts, and really something to launch into our discussion. As we see from both of these presentations, the immense challenge that we're facing, and as Dennis said, I thought it was great. It's not just a huge thing, but it's people, and it's people that we're concerned about, that are at the forefront of our efforts, and who we're actually working with, on the front line to reduce hunger and poverty, improve nutrition, feed 9 billion, 11 billion. It's a staggering challenge, but it's people behind it, and the statistics are there, but statistics are people. So we can have the panel gather. It's a long table for everybody. There's a chair for me, but I'll keep standing. I can't see everybody while sitting down. Then I'll have to wear my glasses.
Put this down for you.
Good. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I'll hold it down. Hey, Dennis, while we're getting settled, I was going to ask, and so as a journalist, when you set out on this project, or at least for this, the coverage for this year and the stories that you're doing, those themes and the cover themes, did you have them all in mind as you started, or have they evolved as the year has gone on? So like the most recent ones, are they kind of different than you thought maybe starting off?
Okay, I have to put on my thing here. Do you hear me? Hello? Not yet. Anyway, the whole project was outlined. We started that project 3 years ago, and probably 2 years ago, the structure of the project was fairly well firmed up. The one that was actually the latest story to the sequence was the one on hunger in America, and that came in about a year ago, because it was like, well, we can do this story on feeding the planet, but we better be also willing to turn the lens upon ourselves as we ponder this question.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, the long lead time that particularly the magazines have. So there's been a lot of thought on this for a long time. And also, as it's framed, and it's great that that National Geographic and the coverage and the readership that you have, and the brilliant photos and the storytelling that you do, and as Dennis was talking about, contributing to the conversation and adding to it with the great resources and talent that you have. So, as I said, a great lineup of panelists. We'll start on the far end. Eileen Kennedy, Tufts University. I've called on Eileen myself. Both read many of her documents, but also heard her speak. Took copious notes, interviews. As I continue with my reporting, I'll darken her doorstep a number of times. Other people that I'm now meeting, I'll darken your doorsteps as well. Mandana, Arabi, Sackler Institute for Nutrition Science, and the marvelous work that they're doing. Looking at this, Shahid Naeem, Earth Institute Center for Environmental Sustainability here at Columbia. Home team, home story, home event. and then Walter Willett, Harvard School of Public Health. So what we've asked those panelists, and then with Dennis and Johan also up here, what we'll try to do is then kind of have an organic conversation among the members of the panel. Anybody with thoughts out here can join in at some stage. But what we'll start is just maybe starting with Eileen and then working our way this way. It's kind of thoughts that you had on the presentations you saw, and the conversation that Dennis is talking about. And then also, as Johan said, the hypothesis of healthy diets are more sustainable. And what would be the research questions for the EAT initiative? So any thoughts that you have on any reaction to them, and anything you'd like to contribute to all of this? Thank you. So,
thank you, Roger. I did make notes during the two presentations, and Johan, you made the comment more eloquently than I am going to make, but that basically environment, agriculture, nutrition have not worked historically very well together, and I would say that's absolutely true. I think a part of the reason, if you look at 30 years ago or even 20 years ago, environmental issues in the nutrition domain were seen as fringe issues. I think we're now on the cusp in thinking about sustainable development goals, and sustainable diets are making real progress. You have FAO, for example, coming up with a definition of what they mean by sustainable diets. In the United States, Dietary Guidelines 2015 has a subgroup dealing specifically with the ecological perspective. And I see a positive of thinking about sustainable diets from the diet point of view, of getting well beyond simply a narrow focus of nutritional adequacy and thinking about issues like availability, access, culture, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I think for this to be successful, and I think we have not been particularly successful up till now, for two reasons. When I was a political appointee in the Clinton administration, I made a statement that used to annoy people. I was representing the administration, and I would make a comment that dietary guidelines never changed anyone's behavior. And I think the evidence suggests that that's true, because what you see is the underlying science is there with the dietary guidelines. But unless we think about strategies for promoting sustainable dietary guidelines, we're not going to make much progress. Around the world, if you look at where there are good consumption data, a very small percentage of the population consumes diets that are consistent with the dietary guidelines. So let me, as I pass on, say, I think the underlying evidence and science is extraordinarily important in thinking about sustainable diets and sustainable goals. But I think unless we combine the science, the evidence, with advocacy, we're not going to get very far.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And also mentioning behavior change, and kind of past panels and maybe other ones that you've attended today, a lot of talk about behavior change, and sometimes granular on that in terms of not only on the eating, but that the importance of breastfeeding and the behavioral change attitudes that may go with that. Women, go into a clinic for delivery. So these are kind of behavior changes that I'm looking at in kind of the book that I'm doing. But it keeps impressing me that it's behavior change that everybody has to go through as we confront these great challenges that we heard about and are talking about. Mandana, anything?
Sure.
you'd like
I
to
guess for me, I always see myself as trying to understand the macro level issues, but always also thinking about micro level implications and small things that can be done in the short run to make changes. And for me, thinking about how we can really improve the linkages between agriculture and nutrition, having worked with UNICEF and with programs that try to improve nutrition at larger scale in countries that deal with a multitude of issues across the spectrum of health and agriculture, I think that we can really create linkages across macro and micro level at different factorial levels to improve the linkages. One issue that we need to be thinking about more is the whole governance of food systems and how it's being affected by globalization and increasing open market engagement of countries, but at the same time, trying to do a better job of not controlling, but I guess better governing the globalization with an eye not just to market participation, but also to improving nutritional availability and adequacy at the population level. I think that generally in the globalization agenda, the economic argument has been the main decision factor and the main driver, and not necessarily the nutrition and health outcomes. And then going to the more micro-level interactions at the country level, one thing that has always struck me is the fact that generally the delivery systems for agriculture and for nutrition and health have not been very well integrated. In many areas, you see the agriculture extension system having their own information, education, counseling, and interaction with the farmers and households, and not necessarily speaking and interacting with the nutrition and health educators, and sometimes even having almost conflicting messages and really working on different aspects, one coming from increasing yield and productivity and income, and the other coming from improving the health and availability of nutritious foods for most vulnerable in the household. So there is a great opportunity there, I think, that we need to really be talking about now, because there are doers at the mid-level management in the country level that they can benefit from guidance that can allow them to make these linkages. While we are actually working our way through the larger development goals and the, I guess, broader dialogues at the macro level, at the international level. And the third thing that I've been really kind of thinking about this week is this whole issue of technology transfer. I know that there are discussions in terms of, we can use technology, especially to reduce the post-production loss in a lot of countries. That's still a large percentage in agriculture. And there are also some concerns that generally farmers may not be adopting technologies as fast as they could or they should. But my personal observation has been that technology has not necessarily been very available and adapted to the needs of the small households and small farms in developing countries. Technologies that would allow them to actually preserve and have more seasonal annual, over the year access to good foods, rather than just having to follow the seasonality and the issues with deficiencies that we have because of lack of access in difficult seasons during the year. I think that technology transfer has not been as strong in those areas, and if we can actually allow for bringing technology to the level that households can actually find it relevant, you will see that the adoption would be a lot higher. And I think there is a lesson to be learned from the water engineering initiatives. Again, when I was at UNICEF, there was this movement from centralized, large-scale, water refining mechanisms to actually going to the level of village and household and bringing household-adapted technologies to them. And they had really, really good success with increasing coverage there. So I feel, the path of agriculture technology and preservation technology going to that direction if we are able to have adaptable technologies for smaller households.
Thank you, Mandana. So, Shahid, and the work that you're doing on environmental sustainability, and how does, from your perspective, how are you thinking of these immense challenges and the questions that have been raised?
Well, thanks. I really appreciate a chance to come and chat with all of you. I think Dennis we had this conversation about who's the odd man out here, and I think I can vie for that. What I stand for, because I think Dennis focuses a lot on communication and using graphics and language to communicate these complex ideas about food and agriculture. And Johan, is someone who has really helped us to scale up from problems about human well-being to his well-known focus on planetary boundaries. And within those contexts, I have been working on biological diversity, which is often absent from these discussions, or brought in, yes, of course it matters. And I actually often think about agricultural diversity, or agrobiodiversity, which is what almost half of my lab works on, agrobiodiversity. And we have a very different take on it. And so when I was asked to participate in the panel, I was really excited about that. And I thought I'd share with you just a couple of thoughts. The first thing is that, if you look at National Geographic with those wonderful series on global warming and population and food, you probably only have to go one page or before to also see beautiful images and really interesting articles about habitats and species, because that institution has always recognized that the two go hand in hand. And when you look at planetary boundaries, as Johan has brought us all to become part of our common language, the one that most of you may have noticed that's really perhaps really been transgressed is biodiversity. I don't want to debate whether we're in another extinction or not, but I think most of us agree that most of the Earth's biodiversity has gone. But it's not just in those systems like the tundra or the prairie or the tropical rainforest. It's also in our agricultural systems. I forget exactly, but I think I read there were something like 7,000 different species of plants that people have identified that people eat. And then you think about what the vast majority of at least our calories come from, it's only like 6 or 7 plants. And of the 8.7 million species that are on this planet, I think it's only like a dozen or so that is a source for our meat, maybe not so much in the marine systems. And as someone who studies biodiversity, I've always known that the great value of having diversity is that you will get not only more productivity and better functioning, but also more resilient and more stable. And for 20 years, my colleagues have been working on this. We've had very high-profile publications. I think I'm in the top 1% of scientists cited in the ISI, which is kind of an honor. But if I actually look in the media, the environmental legislation and environmental management, there's no mention at all about what we do in biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. So this is a great opportunity to bring this to the world of real people who are working with what 60% of our planet is. So I'll just close my comments with a story which I think is interesting, in that I was once brought in to meet one of the governors, I think it was from Amazonas State in Brazil. And he had a translator to translate what we were saying into Portuguese and then what he was saying back to English. And then I think I was the third or fourth as we went around the room, and I got to me, and I was really pleased to get to talk to him. And I said that I work on biodiversity. And then in flawless English, he looked at me and said, "Oh, biodiversity, it's so complex." And I thought, that's the reaction, right? You didn't need a translator. You just wanted to say, don't start talking about biodiversity. It's actually not that complex. I just came from teaching a large class on introductory biology, and we just talked about the molecular basis of diversity. And if undergraduates can learn it, it's just a matter of translating why agrobiodiversity matters as much to agroecosystems as it does to natural systems. A very simple example, I always look for something in the room, is that piano over there. What I like to say is that the rich diversity of music we can get out of there, what that might mean to our psychological and cultural health, is for you to interpret. If you start losing the keys from that, eventually all you have is one note, right? I also think of curry, we're talking about condiments. If you start losing all the spices, eventually all you have is salt, right? It's a simple message. I'm not saying the science isn't complex. The message is simple, and food is a great place to start getting that message out.
Thank you. I'm thinking that I'm actually the odd one out, because I'm guilty in all my reporting, both from the time at the Wall Street Journal and what I'm doing now, is I was just thinking the little amount of time that I've given actually to thinking about these issues of biodiversity and things, and it's usually the people, the farmers and the smallholders and people that I'm talking about, that they're raising that with me or confronting me with the challenges that they're facing kind of on a daily thing. And so I'm taking just as many notes as anyone else. Walter.
Thanks. I've spent most of the last 40 years looking at how diet affects our long-term health and well-being, mostly looking at non-communicable diseases, but also other health outcomes as well. And I was asked to talk about where there's synergy between health outcomes and climate, environmental outcomes. And I think it's useful as a starting point to look at what a healthy diet is. And there's been lots of work on that. But I think it does boil down to 4 elements about which there's a lot of agreement, a lot of consensus. One would be healthy forms of carbohydrate, and mostly that's whole grains and not refined grains, potatoes, and as you heard in West Africa, refined cassava. I think at this, looking at the world as a whole, we're actually producing too many grains, and we should as of today, in today's diet, today's needs actually be producing less. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Second, healthy fats. Fats have been condemned as being unhealthy, but actually unsaturated fats, which include almost all liquid plant oils, improve blood lipid fractions, reduce diabetes risk, and reduce risk of cardiovascular disease. We need more of those on a global basis. Then healthy forms of protein. And from a health standpoint, that means more plant-based protein, legumes, including soy, obviously nuts. And there's room for some animal proteins as well. Poultry, fish has some special nutritional value in terms of omega-3 fatty acids. And there's a lot of evidence now that high consumption of red meat is related to higher risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and some other adverse health outcomes as well. Now, there's appropriately a lot of attention on increasing, getting animal proteins to infants and children in their first few years of life, but in a big picture of the total food supply, total food needs, that's a tiny part of the picture, and there's no problem satisfying the needs of very young children. So I was a bit surprised yesterday when I heard the Director General of FAO saying we don't have to worry about the supply side, that's under control.
He's wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
And,
I'll second that, right.
What planet he is coming from, because, unfortunately enough, I didn't get to ask him about that, because when I look around, I see disaster in all directions, whether I'm looking at Western U.S. Food supply or Asia or Africa, that in this country, the Midwest where I grew up is being flattened. Our family farm in Michigan is complete monoculture. It's corn and soy, and that is happening at a very rapid rate for whatever remaining space is left right across our Midwest. And the consequences of that are huge. Obviously, in biodiversity, just before my eyes, I'm seeing amphibians disappear, pollinators disappear, monarch butterflies disappear. This was something that wasn't supposed to happen in a period of a few years. It's happening very quickly. And those are just sort of tips of the iceberg of what's going on. I think everyone knows the vast majority of that food that we're producing, corn, is being not fed to humans. It's being converted to ethanol so we can drive bigger cars faster, and a huge part of it fed to animals as well. And we consume that primarily as beef and pork. And of course that has adverse health effects, adverse effects on water availability, water pollution, biodiversity, antibiotic resistance, which in the health area is a very big issue, an increasing issue at this time. Well, you could say that's the U.S., and obviously we'd be much better off health-wise and environmentally wise, letting half of that land go fallow, actually, and even lower on the food chain. Looking at India, for example, which yesterday was also soon to be food sufficient. It's sufficient if you look at the total number of calories produced, but if you talk about sufficient in terms of a healthy diet, it's extremely far from a healthy diet. The average serving of fruits and vegetables is 1 per day. It's extremely unbalanced diet in terms of very high amounts of carbohydrate being increasingly refined, and half the children are still malnourished. That has not changed much at all, and diabetes is rampant in adults there, and zooming way past the rates of diabetes in the United States, which is predicted because Asian populations, African and Latin American populations are much more susceptible to diabetes than, given the same diet, than the Northern European populations. So, and in India, like the United States, the food that is being produced in a very unsustainable way. Water tables are rapidly sinking. So even the population is not being fed adequately, but even to the extent that it is being fed, it's not being fed in a sustainable way. So it does seem like we have huge issues on the production side. There are major issues on the processing and distribution side, which is obviously not directly in the field of agriculture, and it's why we need to work together on many fronts. So where can we find synergy in all of this? I think the most obvious is to substantially reduce consumption of red meat, especially cattle, and limit dairy products. It's clear we don't need the 3 servings a day that we say we need in this country because our calcium requirements are set far, far too high. I think the WHO recommendations are adequate intake of 500 milligrams a day is indeed adequate for adults and maybe all of the youngest children. There are some other areas where we clearly healthy foods that can be, I think, produced in an environmentally sustainable way. Nuts have a particularly healthy role. It's pretty amazing when you look at all the health advantages of nuts. And they can be produced on trees, although ground nuts are also healthy. It's clear many people are going to want to consume some animal products, animal protein sources. And poultry and fish actually look pretty healthy as compared to red meat and can be produced in a way that has much less environmental footprint than raising cattle. So if I was talking to someone who's thinking about where to go or where to put resources in agricultural research, everything we do can be done in a better way. We can make constant improvements for sure, but in particular, investing in environmentally sustainable ways to produce legumes, to produce nuts in a way that's affordable so they're available, and spending some time in investment in aquaculture and poultry also seems like a very good idea. And finally, I think looking at the challenge before us, I think we can't forget about the need to stabilize populations. It's sort of been put off the table in terms of conversations. And as much as I think, well, I grew up in an agricultural research family, and there's a lot, I know a lot of bright people, very creative, resourceful, committed people who will find many ways of doing everything better than we are doing today. But knowing how politically we never act on time, we never act perfectly, I think we can't reach our objectives of feeding the world a healthy diet unless we stabilize our population.
Thank you, Walter. Eileen, you had...
Well, a couple of thoughts. I think the data are clear that globally we've moved in the direction of less healthy diets and less healthy lifestyles. But as you were talking, and I'd like to look at it from an ag as well as a dietary patterns point of view, I was reminded of a statement that Kofi Annan made, the former Secretary General of the UN, that the meeting we were at, the world is replete with technologies, agricultural technologies that have never made it off the shelf. Tested technologies, but have never, you could say the same for health nutrition. And so I think when you think about optimum or improving diet quality, I like to differentiate between consumer need and consumer demand. And I think we need to think of both parts of the equation. Obviously, consumer need, based on objective criteria, there are populations worldwide that need to move their diets in different directions of dietary patterns. But consumer demand has moved in a very different direction, where at what some economists would call an inflection point, with small increments at very low levels of income, you get some bounce in income, and we see what happens. There's more demand for animal products, sugars, fats. And so thinking about what is it we do as a global community to bring the consumer need and consumer demand closer together, and is it incremental or is it quantum changes? Having been a former government official in the U.S., I think the theory and concept of sustainable intensification and sustainable diets is something that we should explore and obviously should be part of the Sustainable Development Goals. But if I were sitting in UK, US, Rwanda, I'd want to know a lot more about what the effects of changes of agricultural policies are on actual dietary patterns and national health. And I think, this sounds like an academic, but I think we need a lot more research in reaching the end user. And I'll get back to Howdy's comment this morning, a question where in Rwanda, I think it was Howdy, you have a bean variety, high iron. I call that stealth nutrition. You're improving iron intake, but yet at the same time with that agriculture, you're also improving incomes of the household. That's a win-win. And I think, Johan, when you talked about sustainable intensification, I think getting beyond that 30,000-foot version and what is it exactly we are suggesting governments and farmers do. And again, Doug Brown's comment this morning, it isn't necessarily micronutrient-rich vegetables we're encouraging to reduce. It might be coffee, but what levers are we using to protect the farmer, protect the consumer, and add to national wealth to provide goods and services?
Johan, did you want to reply, or the note I got earlier was that where you have to break precisely at 1600 to go to the final plenary. So I guess we've got about 15 minutes left. And so, yeah, Johan, if you want to reply to him, maybe we can take a question or two.
Remark, and then a little reflection that was triggered by Shahid's piano analogy. So I fully agree, Eileen, it has to be taken down to the practical level. And I can see no better, let's say, platform of brain trust than the CGIAR to do that. And I think we've come, a significant part of the way. I think Shahid is absolutely right that the evidence from biodiversity research shows that we've come to a point where agriculture, the number is actually zero. We must actually have as a goal at the local scale of zero biodiversity loss when it comes to sustainable intensification. That's quite a neat number. You don't have to kind of juggle around with it too much. So the era of expansion is finished. So it's zero expansion into natural ecosystems. And one key reason for that is what was alluded to by Halder upstairs, that half of our emissions of greenhouse gases are taken up by natural ecosystems, not by agriculture. Agriculture is a net source of carbon dioxide, while natural ecosystems is an immense net sink. I think we know fairly well how to deal with nitrogen and phosphorus in terms of sustainable balance in different farming systems, and we know the enormous imbalance there where the US, Europe, parts of India and parts of China, Australia uses too much and Africa uses too little. So I think we can come a reasonable way on defining even at the local scale. Then I fully agree with Shahid that biodiversity is often the missing part of the agenda. And I would argue that it's as serious as climate change, because climate change, there's some regret period. I mean, we can at least think of taking out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but once we lose a functional group in a landscape, it's gone forever. And just to share with you another analogy of how to do this, how to explain the importance of biodiversity, I had the privilege of talking to the board of Procter & Gamble, and the chair of the Procter & Gamble board happens to be the former Mexican president, Cedillo. And we used the following with our students to say, to understand the role of functional groups in ecosystems, you can think of Manhattan. And if you would chop out 20% of the population of Manhattan, New York would probably continue functioning quite well, in fact, if you would lose 20% of the diversity. And then the president, in the midst of this, interrupted me and said, oh, no, that won't work. If you take out the Mexicans, New York collapses. And I said, well, yes, Mr. President, that's absolutely true, but I was not going to take the Mexicans as an example. I was thinking of the fire brigade or the nurses or the police force. But that's exactly the point, the risk we're taking with biodiversity. You lose certain critical functional groups, and the system collapses, even though you have a lot of biodiversity left. And I think that point can be hammered home through communications such as the piano.
Yeah, thanks. Let's go questions here, and then maybe Sarah. Yep. Yes. Either use a mic or shout.
No, either way, yeah. So down the road at Woods Hole, an ecologist was trained in marine biology who really started a major movement in North America about environmental protection. She was called Rachel Carson and wrote Silent Spring. She didn't change the tide by demonstrating resistance in insects to DDT, which was actually shown by 1946. She published a book. And I just wonder whether, we understand what is the dynamic of changing cultural expectation through routes that don't come naturally to scientists. She was trained as a scientist, but actually moved into scientific publishing and then to the novel that probably everyone remembers her by.
Any
Well,
thoughts? That
I think sometimes researchers stroke scientists are not necessarily the best communicators and vice versa. And I'm going to, Dennis, I wrote down a term you use, joy of food. How do we translate information in a persuasive way? I try to, in one of the dietary guidelines committees, instead of saying eat a variety of food, enjoy a variety of food. I was lambasted as heretical. We don't want people to enjoy food. So I lost that battle. But I do think, I mean, people like Roger and others, I believe you have to have the evidence base. But then there's a different skill set. Sometimes individuals have both. But think about how do you persuade, how do you advocate for a certain point of view? And I think cultures are constantly changing. And some things change quickly, others take a longer period of time.
Walt, did you?
We do have a lot of experience with this, in part through the anti-smoking campaign, where the WHO has looked at that carefully, what it took to actually make our environment largely smoke-free here. We haven't totally solved it, but rates have come down from about 60% in men to less than 20% in men. Now, it took about 40 years to do that, so cultural change doesn't happen overnight. But it took, as Eileen mentioned, strong scientific evidence and layers of it. And the industry fought back at every step, is still fighting. And we see that happening today in the food world as well, that Big Soda in particular is trying to discredit science and everything that's published about the harmful effects of soda, for example. So there's constant battles there. But it took scientists working to communicate, but public advocacy groups played a very large role. Economists say correctly that they played an important role with putting in place taxes to modify behavior. But eventually it does become self-sustaining, and there is a tipping point in culture when it becomes no longer culturally acceptable to be lighting up as we would have in this room 30 or 40 years ago.
Walt, the big difference there, and I talk to my students about this all the time, anti-smoking or cessation of smoking is a targeted behavior, seatbelt campaign, targeted behavior. There are some components of that you can extrapolate, but small amounts of tobacco are bad. You're hard-pressed to say, unless it's an adulterated food, small amounts of any kind of food are bad. And I think that the challenge is, whether you use negative or positive, how do you package the healthy eating in a way that motivates consumers in practical ways to change certain behaviors? And that's going to vary by age, by gender, by socio-demographic groups. I'm not suggesting we don't do it, but I think it's a more complicated scenario than smoking or seatbelts.
Well, but it does happen, and actually I disagree a little bit. Your dietary guidelines do make a difference. That we did see fat come down from 42% of calories to 33% of calories, and it was a mistake, and the evidence wasn't there to do it. But we did change behavior. We saw egg consumption come way down, almost 50%.
But you only saw that in food eaten and prepared at home. You did not see that in food either eaten out of home or bought out of home.
But the total intake did come down. And for the first time last year, I was told there's most of the bread sold in this country is whole grain bread. No. So there are major shifts that do happen. It's not 100%.
Right, but it doesn't happen overnight. And
absolutely.
That you have to take those individual components and try to then ramp up to a total diet.
Yeah.
Mandana, did you have your...
Yeah, I was just thinking, because we were also asked to address some of research gaps. I think what was very contributing to the success of the anti-tobacco campaign was using systems thinking and looking at where are some touch points in the system where you can actually be very effective. So there was a lot of thinking behind how you design these campaigns for anti-tobacco activities. And we still have to really utilize systems thinking better for nutrition, and then also for environmentally sustainable and viable nutrition in agriculture. And I think that's definitely a research gap. And one big question there would be a better understanding the incentives, especially for vulnerable households, for using their resources to make healthy choices and to invest those resources in healthy, environmentally sustainable choices rather than their current choices. And there needs to be a better understanding of that before we are very prescriptive about these issues.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a really good point. The microphone is...
This is Sarah Shear from Eco Agriculture Partners. I wanted to get back to the theme of this session, which was nutrition-sensitive landscapes, which I've actually heard very little of in this conversation. Even this last round of extremely excellent discussion shifted us back into thinking very subsectorally about how we deal with a specific kind of nutrition problem, rather than a larger systems thinking about the landscapes we live in. And I was really struck, Dennis, I mean, I love this video. It's just, I think it's just phenomenal. That's an aside. But those pictures of the really gigantic Brazilian and Iowan landscapes that are monoculture as far as the eye can see are extremely lacking in biodiversity. They are extremely bad for carbon emissions. They are extremely bad for watershed, both water quality and water supply and depletion of aquifers. That is not a vision that we want to see in the future. But I think there's been a huge effort in a lot of the discussions about the balance between agriculture and biodiversity of thinking at a global scale about the total amount of forest cover or natural habitat and the total amount of land that's under agricultural cover, when it's extremely important that the landscapes where those things are happening are also biodiverse, that they're also climate friendly, that they also have clean water in those places that are 80% under agriculture. They actually shouldn't be on 80% under agriculture to do that. But I think we have missed, by not having concrete, specific places that we're looking at and saying, how can those places over time be sustainable? And what kind of food systems? And I'm an economist, I'm a believer in trade, but not trade where there's a huge landscape that's producing one kind of food. That's not a sustainable, you can't have sustainable diets, you can't have biodiversity in those kind of landscapes. So I am hoping that the follow-up for this is to look much more closely at really what do we mean by nutrition-sensitive landscapes, because there were many things that I didn't hear today that I was expecting to hear about the availability of using managed wild areas for food, about having just, I mean, there's just many things that can be done that would have many positive co-benefits by looking at these interactions, not at the national level, not looking at our national statistics, but looking landscape by landscape at what's really happening to the people, the nature of the food production systems there. Anyway, I'll just stop there.
Well, we've got 4 minutes to address that question in a central part of our gathering. So
maybe this misses your point, but actually there was a story that we did a year ago on nitrogen, and Johan's boundary study spoke to biodiversity and the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. And, one of the things that doesn't get talked about is the disruption of the nitrogen cycle, and how many people on Earth wouldn't exist today if it weren't for the invention of synthetic nitrogen. And, if we stopped using it today, we'd have to, vote 40% of us off the planet. And so now we're in this situation where we have to manage, unless we want to do that, we have to figure out how we're going to manage that particular part of one of these large global cycles. And that is very much a managing nutrients on landscapes so that they're not then going downstream into creating all the hypoxic zones that we get to read about.
Shahid.
Well, thanks for noting that maybe the actual framework for this meeting was a little hard to track. I think sometimes when you're very close to a subject, you don't realize that you've sort of not made that apparent to your audience. And I do think I should change disciplines because after 20 years you need it. But I think, it was actually, I think it was, maybe it was Fabrice, but the idea about biodiversity and ecosystem services being not just, the calories, but also the nutritional diversity that you would get, to think about that and about human health. To me, it was a matter of scaling. That, you can't have a healthy individual if their household isn't healthy. You can't have a healthy household if the community or the city isn't healthy. And you can't have a healthy city or community if the ecosystems within which they are, and on up to the biosphere, right? And to me, it seemed that it tracked to this wonderful idea that if we're trying to increase nutritional diversity, because that's one of the better ways to try to get a more balanced diet, then that would come with more diversity, which means you would scale up to the ecosystem services as well as the diet. So in a way, they go hand in hand. And I probably should have said that what motivated my thinking was that I think it'd be wonderful if nutrition-sensitive landscapes, without actually having to do any extra effort, wound up improving the ecosystem delivery of these systems. Because I was thinking in the very first picture that Dennis showed, as someone who wanders the wild world, the thing that caught my eye was the beautiful mountain that was snow-covered in the back of was the Willamette Valley. And I was thinking, I bet there's not as much snow on that mountain anymore. And the forest that was there and providing all its ecosystem services has probably been turned to food. Can we get the food to do that as well? Not if it doesn't have, not if it's only producing mostly one nutritional need, but if it's producing many nutritional needs, I bet it will. We need to do the research to prove that, because I think it's true. When it came to the smoking campaigns and other campaigns, good science is what helped sell it. I have to be honest, even after 20 years of doing this, I don't think our science is that rock solid yet.
Yep. Thank you. I've just gone 1,600 hours for 4 o'clock. They keep opening the door with another sign that says, oh, they want to be punctual. So thanks to the panel, a great job, and I think it's really helped us. And thank you for bringing us back to the nutrition thing. That, yeah, the concept of feeding the world and feeding the planet, nourishing the planet is what we're talking about, and nourishing in all the aspects that they've talked about, and not just the people, but the planet that we live on and sustainability of it. So, thanks a lot. I'm to send you all up to whatever floor it's on. Climb the stairs to the plenary room, and thanks.